We'd like to apologize for the delay in beginning, but a serious matter has come up in the Commission on the Ministry's staff. As you know, Dr. Edmund Steinle is the chairman of this commission. Dr. Steinle had a collapse this evening and was taken to the hospital. Apparently, however, the latest report is that he will be out of danger, or is out of danger. And we are still hoping that it will be possible for him to be with us tomorrow. However, that, as you would understand, may be out of the question. Therefore, we are going to have to proceed as well as we can. And my name is Anderson, George Anderson. I'm a member of the commission, and I've been asked to lead the little panel that will make the original presentations this evening. Can you hear all right in the back? Can you hear okay? Fine. The format we propose is a fairly simple one. We want first to hear from certain members of the commission on specific phases of the commission's report. As you have your documents with you, the Commission's report begins on page 254 of the large bulletin of reports, or perhaps you have the small off-print, and in that case it begins on page 1. That's the last simple thing you'll hear this evening, probably. We propose that in this first period of time, we say a word about the background of the Commission's report and say something about its form, and then introduce briefly the preface, the position statements, the Commission's statement on the ordination of women, and then some general statements about the concerns of the Commission as they are portrayed in the recommendations. We will then open the hearing for your comments, and we'll invite you to share with us concerns you have. First on the report in general, and after a portion of time on that, we will move to the specific recommendations and ask for your guidance and consultation on those. So that we really have three phases. First, some introductory remarks, then your comments on the Commission's report as a whole, and finally something on the specific recommendations. We'll try to observe the time in the sense that we do allow ample time for work on the recommendations. As you know, this commission is the second to study the question of the doctrine of the ministry. The first commission reported at the 1966 convention of the church, and the present commission was then given the mandate to cover many of the same questions, and additionally to study the question of the ordination of women. We had the advantage of the documents of the first study commission to use in our own thinking, and we began then by going over the official documents of the church to see what they said about the ministry. We had interviews with concerned lay people. We had on our commission a number of pastors who reported to us concerns that they had, and other pastors, and many of our commission members are very close to the parish ministry. And in this way, it enabled us to build up something of the problems that the parish pastors seemed to feel were uppermost in their minds about the ministry. Out of these sources, we began then to shape questions which we felt were essential to be answered. We came up with a long, long list of questions, of areas of concern, and then we began to see that they focused in certain primary areas, and it seemed that the basic one was the concept of the ministry as the ministry of word and sacraments. At the present time, our church, in determining who will and will not be a minister, places great weight on the statement, the ministry of word and sacraments. And this has involved us in some very difficult questions as we have entered areas of ministry which are a little different from the typical parish ministry where the word is preached regularly and the sacraments administered frequently. There was also the problem that many parish pastors found themselves feeling that they were spending much of their time doing work which was not specifically related to what they considered the ministry of word and sacraments. Coupled with this was the fact that with the rise of the concept of lay ministry, we began to find many pastors wondering what was so different about what they were doing that laymen couldn't do. In fact, one of the comments we discovered from the floor debate on the First Commission's document was that there was considerable disappointment that more attention had not been given to the place of the ordained clergyman. The First Commission's report was very clear on the fact of the ministry of all Christians. But the specific role of the ordained clergyman, it seemed to many of the delegates in 1966, had not been adequately treated. So this became one of our concerns. As we began to work on this cluster of questions, it became clear to us that we would have to look at this concept of the ministry of word and sacraments and try to discover what it was saying in the confessions and what it meant for us as Lutherans to say that our ministry was a ministry of word and sacraments. The result of this was, as the preface indicates, a statement of a twofold dimension to the ministry. That the ministry is first of all representative. That is, that the public ministry of the church is representative in the sense that it brings to the church those elements which the church needs in order to survive, word and sacrament, that is. That without these elements presented to the church would cease to be itself. It requires constant referral to and strengthening from word and sacraments. But the minister himself does not convey these. He rather represents in the church these constitutive elements, ministry or word and sacrament. Secondly, it was necessary to be clear that while laymen in certain conditions have always been granted the possibility of ministering word and sacrament, nevertheless, officially the church selected men for its public ministry to perform and to guard the role of word and sacrament. Therefore, we added the term official. Now, please be clear. We are not suggesting that the typical title now for a minister be official representative. That would be tragic. And we are not happy, as the preface says. We are not happy with the two words. They are certainly not phrases that will ring long in the history of denominational polity. We didn't try to do that. We tried to use terms that would be guidelines to church officials who must decide whether any given ministry would qualify as an ordained ministry. And in order to do that, we have settled on these two phrases, one of which stresses the word and sacrament element, and the other which stresses the public nature of the ministry. Now, we'd be glad to talk further about this term with you, but please understand we are not proposing this particularly as a single phrase, official representative. There is a comma between them, and the comma is important because it represents the two dimensions of the ministry we are discussing. The report itself may be disappointing to you because it does not have a very long, full-bodied theological section. We started out with that. Two reasons seem to govern the fact that we no longer have the report in that form. One was that in the interest of brevity and clarity, we felt it would be better to give you our conclusions and to let you see what points of intersection the Commission reached, without necessarily going into all the detailed discussion and niceties of our deliberations. This is not to hold them secret from you, it's simply to make the bulletin of reports 1 ounce lighter so that it does not weigh any more than 3 pounds. The second thing we were hoping was that we would avoid the traditional and long-standing difficulty in American Lutheranism over the very large questions of the source of authority and so on in the ministry. We are not here trying to develop a timeless document. We are trying to develop a working definition which can be used by administrators of the church in deciding whether any specific ministry is qualified to be an ordained ministry. We have also tried to indicate a few other lines of approach. We certainly hope, as the report indicates, that there will be an ongoing study developing from this which will move us toward a stronger and much more exciting, perhaps, concept of the total theology of ministry. We felt that the hour did require some working definition, so that the second part of the paper consists of position statements. And we will later hear a report on these, which will deal with them in terms of their outlook and their import for the rest of the report. And finally, after sharing with you what conclusions the Commission came to, we have provided certain specific recommendations. And it is these recommendations that we hope will become the focus for your discussion, because it is these recommendations that embody the concepts, the theological positions, as well as the practical decisions which the Commission had to reach. We hope that the discussion will ultimately revolve around whether these recommendations adequately do for you what you want your church to do and say about the ministry at this point. If they don't do all you want to say, you can tell us that, but if they're moving the direction you want, we hope that you would see the wisdom of moving toward concurrence now and continual working toward a further development along those lines. Now, I think at this point it would be useful to introduce those members of the Commission who are here, and then we'll call on a couple of them to make some further comments about specific sections of the report. Most of them are sitting conveniently in the front row, and if there are others sitting elsewhere, I'll ask you to stand later. Jake Heikkinen from Gettysburg Seminary, Martin Heineken from Philadelphia Seminary, Ralph Peterson from New York, parish pastor there, Al Stone from Washington, Spokane, Seattle, excuse me. Margaret Ehrmart from Wittenberg College, University, excuse me. Sister Anna Melville, deaconess. I guess Al Keck is the next, pastor from Hickory, North Carolina. Are there other members of the commission here that are sitting? Now, those of you who we've planted in the audience, please keep quiet at this point. These are the members of the commission who are here present, honestly, and I think now it would be helpful to hear from three of them regarding, first, the position statements, secondly, the ordination of women, and thirdly, some remarks on the general concerns of the recommendations as a whole. I'd ask Dr. Heineken to speak on the position statements.
In the few minutes that I have, I could not possibly exegete all the position statements. Just the form criticism, trying to cull out the various authors, would keep us here a week or so, to say nothing of the possible nuances of just one single preposition. So I propose to do only two things. First, to indicate the status of these statements, and secondly, to try to indicate a key to their understanding and interpretation. First, then, a word about the status of these statements. They're not up for adoption at this convention, so there's no use arguing about niceties of expression. It should be obvious to all, I think, that in the Church of the Lutheran Reformation, we do not decide upon doctrines by a majority vote of a church convention, where the issue is most often decided by who happens to get in the most seductive word at the most vulnerable point. If we really want doctrines to be made authoritatively binding, then we really could do no better than to accept the prudent procedure of the Roman Catholic teaching magisterium, where the Pope, speaking ex cathedra, only declares officially what has been distilled through the years in the Church under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And I think that one of the most disastrous misunderstandings of the Augsburg Confession's view of the Church is that it insists upon doctrinal uniformity as essential to the Church, whereas what it clearly states as alone constitutive of the Church and essential to its unity is the actual living proclamation of the gospel, the word of judgment and of grace. And this is never possible by isolated individuals going it alone. But this can be done only within the actual fellowship of believers. And what these position statements do, therefore, is to reflect the understanding of the gospel as this centers specifically on the ministry of the church. And they are not, as has been said, intended as timeless truths to stand forever. They reflect how we, in our particular position in time and place, as members of a confessional church, propose to articulate our understanding of the church and its ministry for today. And this really represents a choice among the various possibilities in the ecumenical church today, and we're not trying to cover up this fact. And how you vote on the recommendations will largely be determined by whether or not you agree with the position statements in general. And therefore, they're open to question and to challenge. Now, secondly, as the key to the interpretation of these statements, everything that is said about the church's nature and mission, and then specifically about the church's ministry, is based upon the recognition that the church's being and nurture, its health and strength, the fulfillment of its God-given task in the world, depends upon the affirmation, as Luther put it, God's people cannot be without God's word, and God's word cannot be without God's people. And it is this which gives the church its peculiar mission and distinguishes it from what other people of goodwill created in God's image are also concerned about. Every Christian, this is the priesthood of all believers, is entrusted with the word of judgment and of grace, an absolutely reliable word of promise, on which alone his identity as a forgiven and accepted child of God rests. The authority, the power, the full efficacy, the unfailing refuge, as well as the constant arousement and spur to action, is always that living word, and this will never let him rest. This makes him a truly free man. This frees him from his bondage to false religiosity, to do his work in the world. There were really two main reasons for this commission, the one to deal with the minister's so-called identity crisis, and the other the address to the status of women in the church. And everything that is said about the ordained ministry, resting upon the call from the church to perform a specific function, then depends upon the recognition of the full authority and efficacy of God's word. This provides the necessary flexibility and structure, openness to change, to creative advance. It makes specific and continuing education a necessity. It demands pastoral care for pastors themselves. It destroys the disastrous solo ministry of the Herr Pastor and makes him member of a team under God's word. And if it's really the handling of the word of God that's decisive, then whether this be done by male or female is not decisive. What is decisive is that the ministry of the word will be enriched by the contribution a woman can make because she's a woman. And I say, vive la différence.
Now we'd like to introduce to you the reason that Dr. Heineken has come to this challenging French quotation, and that is Mrs. Margaret Ehrmart, who's been a fine member of our commission and will speak on the ordination of women.
I have in my notes here one line that says, women, Friday evening, June the 26th, 5 minutes. About 5 minutes. I assure you that I'm trying to bring off a tour de force, and I'll try to stick within at least 7 minutes. I think it's only fair, even though I'm restricted in time, to tell you what led me to this moment. A speaker ought to explain his or her position right from the first. I'm an historian by profession, and I say that only because it ought to enable me to recognize an historic moment when I see one. I'm also a preacher's kid, probably by accident. And I've been placed in this hot spot, probably by default. But I welcome it, even though it may fairly be said that never has so volatile a subject been approached by so small a team in so short a time. It is indeed really too late for the church to be prophetic in its actions vis-a-vis the so-called delicate problem or the so-called woman problem. But it is not too late for the church to be positively responsive to a very real situation. I want to touch upon some aspects of this situation and then try to convey to you something of the spirit in which we conducted our research and came to our conclusions, and then I will hopefully have done. The real situation that confronts us is this, in very practical terms, that there are now, according to the latest statistics gathered by Miss Mildred Winston, 250 women of our church, the LCA, who are now equipped with higher degrees and with training in specialized services and various kinds of training in various fields that are extremely important to the church and to all churches in the crises of our days. A few of these women, as a matter of fact not so few, are preparing for ordination, and the numbers of these women are growing. That is a very real situation. Now, this commission, in its report, has called upon the church to respond to this situation, and indeed, as I have said so often in the various writings we've done on the commission, to respond to the very grave social revolution that is going on in our time, in trying to ferret out what is to be the shape or the shapes of the ministries of our church, by responding to our services, in terms of our services to this society in revolution, that we should respond creatively by opening all of our ministries of the church, even the preaching ministry, to qualified people, including women. It is also a very real fact that the weight of cultural and social traditions is very enormous, and it qualifies what women can do and what is expected of them. But no Christian can afford to forget, in debating this matter, that Jesus was the first to bring a real breakthrough for the services of women. It did not matter to Jesus the sex of the person to whom he was ministering or with whom he spoke. That was a real breakthrough. And the women who worked in the early church took advantage of that. Paul thought they were a little over-enthusiastic, and these are the things that are quoted mostly. But this isn't all that Paul has said about women and the ministries of women to the church. Thirdly, I would ask every Christian here to remember that the church has traditionally, historically, led the way in the education of its women up to a certain point. And then it stopped short of acknowledging their capacities for exercising that particular and peculiar vitality of the Spirit, which belongs especially to the called and, as we put it now, the ordained. The Commission also studied with great gravity and care the so-called hazards attending the ordination of women to the ministry. One of these dangers that everybody thinks about is the danger to the ecumenical movement or to ecumenical concerns. I'm not going into this matter now, But one should think about this very carefully, and one should read the papers. The Episcopalians have indeed studied this subject for many, many years and have done the very best writing, I think, that anybody has done on the matter of the ordination of women, in terms of justice, in terms of their services, in terms of the hazards and everything else. But their predictions about the ordination of women in the Swedish church, that it would break off connections between the Swedish church and the Anglican church, have not materialized. And the Episcopalians are continuing their study of this subject. And it looks as if they are ready to move on the matter of ordination, as indeed the Canadian branch of the Anglican Church has moved considerably forward. I should remind us also, as we think about this matter, that more than half the Lutherans in the world belong to churches that do indeed ordain women. Some of you perhaps do not know that the American Lutheran Church Council just the other day, and this council includes the presidents of the districts of the American Lutheran Church, voted to approve ordination and to submit the matter to whenever their convention is, I think it is in the fall. That the Catholic Church has various lively elements within it that is pushing the hierarchy of the church nearer and nearer to a fuller recognition of women, probably short of priesthood for a generation, I don't know. But it is apt to be true, as we have kind of prophesied in our commission report, that in those churches which are most conservative in this matter, where the lid is on most, pressed down most tightly, that these perhaps will blow the highest in the end. I don't know where that leads us, but in any event, it is a prophecy that looks like it might have some validity. I would also point out to you the fact that the women of the churches of the world have achieved a pretty firm ecumenical outlook, and they have been more lively and more productive in their ecumenical writings and in their ecumenical fellowships, and more even-handed and more, well, what should I say, progressive in their look toward the future than many of their counterparts organizations among whom there are many men, like the World Council of Churches, which studiously studies this subject year after year and hopefully will come up with something. This is not meant to be derogatory. I'm simply saying they are moving more slowly than the women are. I also would remind you that the board of directors of the Lutheran Church Women have made a very cogent and good statement of the cause of their support for the ordination of women. All right, now another hazard is, as it has always been explained, the identity crisis for male ministers. I think it would be stupid not to recognize that that is indeed a problem. But I will say, who does not have an identity crisis in this moment? As a teacher of students on the campus, as a League of Women Voters, as a member of the Urban League, as a woman head of a family, as a woman alone. All of us have identity crises. It is the nature of the society and the state of the world in which we live. I think it would be unfair to blame the entire identity crisis of the male ministers to the marching problem of women who wish to enter into the higher echelons of the church. So that it is not the woman problem so much as a problem of how the church is to define its ministries in this world and still be obedient to its tradition and to the gospel. Here is the crux of the matter. Now, closely related to this problem is one that is always mentioned, less often now than it used to be, that is the feminization of the church. I don't know how the phraseology of that particular phraseology of the problem, what its implications are, as if this would be the worst of all possible evils. If it would drive the men out of the church, I would say that probably would be the worst of all possible evils. But I don't know that we can assume this. All the commission is saying is this, that if men and women together keep their eyes on the mission of the church, that this problem would not mature as a problem of the feminization of the church. When women are frustrated in their work, then men are deprived too. When men are frustrated and lose their identity, or however we want to put it, then women suffer too. As Christians, our belief in community means that nobody in that community can suffer without the whole community suffering. This fact should obtain for men and women too. A male-female confrontation at this point within the church, or at any point indeed, would be self-defeating for both sexes, and in its essence, unchristian. In this sense, I have often called myself, even before in my addresses to women in the women's liberation movement, the Uncle Tom of the women's liberation movement. I would regret this kind of polarization, both as woman and as Christian. This commission has urged that by whatever means possible, the church structure her services in a world in revolution so as to make full use of the resources of Christian men and women in community. Those ministries broadly defined as the glorification of God as revealed in Christ, the worshiping of God as a community, the proclamation of the word, the announcement of forgiveness, the healing and reconciling of the world. These are duties and missions which women can perform, perhaps maybe not as well as, but how do we know, as male ministers. A Catholic has defined Catholicity as being essentially open to the future. This is the spirit, I think, in which this commission has put forth the document which we now lay before you.
The final member of the commission to interpret for you the spirit of the recommendations now is Pastor Ralph Peterson from New York. Ralph?
It was Gertrude Stein, I think, who once said, something's ever going to happen, someone's got to make it happen, or else someone's got to see to it that someone else makes it happen. And that basically was my spirit in participating in the commission on the ministry. Personally, I felt that a commitment to the parish, while parish ministry might be deadly for some, I don't think it's dead by any means. I'm very strongly committed to the parish ministry. I was also committed to the fact that so often commissions, consultations can produce documents that never lead anywhere. After 4 years of experience in the National Council of Churches, where with the Department of the Ministry, I attended many a consultation, many a discussion on the matter of ministry, I knew how so often ecumenical groups and commissions would have great discussions which wouldn't lead anywhere. Thirdly, I was very much committed to what I would call the awareness or the understanding of people who practice a certain role, a leadership responsibility. I don't hesitate for a minute to say I'm identified with the Academy of Parish Clergy, which relates me with other clergy of Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish groups in the United States, where we feel as colleagues, as leaders, we have an understanding and a commitment and hopefully a growing understanding and research of what leadership roles are. So this was the stance that I took in as participating in this commission, feeling that we had to make certain things happen to enable the leadership of our Lutheran Church in America, the pastoral leadership, the pastoral ministry, to have a greater effectiveness in this time. There was a recent study done of clergy of the United Church of Christ, men who left the ministry. It's called ex-minister, ex-pastor. And it suggests there are three basic questions which confront pastors, ministers today. Who am I? In other words, the professional awareness, as opposed to just being a person. Where am I serving? In other words, the question of the system within which one has a ministry. And what am I doing? In other words, the role. And I would submit that this report attempts to make it possible within our own Lutheran Church in America to come to a clearer understanding of who we are, where we serve, and what we do. There's a book which is going to be written shortly of another denomination which is based on research that has been gathered of this Protestant denomination, which I think ought to set forth the kind of context of the kind of dilemmas which we face shortly. This report indicates, for instance, that one half of the parishes at least are not viable any longer, either in terms of the kind of salary they can afford or the kind of budget they maintain or the number of communicants who participate. And that one half of the clergy are not going to be doing anything more than wring their hands, be zombies, and hope the bishop will do and the laity will pay. And the choice, as this author will report it, is either death or resurrection. One half of the show will sink below the waves in 10, 15 years, and one half of the people will weather it just fine, and two bunches will pay the price, the sweet shut-ins who really pray and who are important to the body of Christ, and one half of the clergy who will starve. It suggests that a vast revolutionary structural change is needed within the churches, with new forms of ministry and new expressions of the pastoral office. Now, in this report, the kinds of recommendations which we have prepared hopefully make it possible for this kind of ministry to emerge. Let me just list some of the kinds of concerns that we thought important and which are reflected in this recommendation. I've already addressed the matter of male and female, but there's been the whole question of career guidance. The fact that at various points men who enter the ministry at one point, at another point leave. And it's no longer termed demit, but it's resign. In fact, the whole understanding of career guidance is viewed as a legitimate expression and a kind of support system which the church should provide. It says something about theological education, that no longer is it required that at least 1 year be 1 year's experience be in a theological school of our own Lutheran Church in America, that it can be done in any school. It says also something about the requirement of practical experience other than the traditional 3 years in a parish, that perhaps other means of experience in the practice of ministry are equally appropriate if the calling agency would say so and determine this. There's a whole matter of the tent-making ministry, where we say that perhaps increasingly it's no longer economically viable for men to starve or to be exploited, thinking they're doing God's will, and perhaps that ways must be made possible now for men to earn their living part-time or full-time in other ways, as well as to have a ministry. But ordination does not necessarily imply full-time employment. It also suggests that ways of strategic entry into other levels of society are possible through this means. We also point to a continuing commission on the ministry, which studies the problems of ministry. In our field, as well as in any other, there is no answer provided once and for all, but it becomes an ongoing process as we can continue in the practice of our ministry. There's the matter of integration of the structures of the church. I don't know how many of you have been as bothered as we are in our own synod about the complexity of the commissions of a board of college education and a board of theological education and other boards and agencies that guide persons into the ministry, vocations committees, groups that counsel a person through their theological education and later placement. We call for a coordination and an integration of the structures within our denomination for a more effective means by which one given human individual is guided to his own position of leadership. We also raise the question of the diaconate, for so often in our own church the whole question of the diaconate, the movement that arose in the last century, and the fact at the same time among churches the whole position and understanding of a diaconate, male as well as female, living in community as well as in separate forms of service, offers, at least I think, many dynamic and expressive ways of new forms of ministry and partnership. These are some of the questions that I thought important, that are reflected in this document and to which the Commission has addressed itself. And what we've done basically is to try and make certain things happen by changing bylaws, and that's why there are so many recommendations, because to make things happen in our church, you've got to change the bylaws of our own LCA, you've got to change the standards, you've got to make recommendations to executive council or to various boards. And so that basically reflects then the reason, the rationale, and the background for why our commission has addressed itself in this way to the issues to which we think are important to enable new forms, more flexible forms of ministry, not because we believe the parish or pastors are dead or even deadly, but that they must come alive in new and dynamic ways.
We'd now like to solicit your help in looking over the report. We appreciate your patience while we have tried to tell you what we had hoped to do. This is the place where you can pose questions, make suggestions, make speeches of moderate length. And according to the rules of this hearing, we are asking that delegates have the opportunity to make their comments known first, and there are certain other recognized representatives whom we'll be glad to hear from too. But we must allow the delegates at least to have their chance to clarify and to make certain they understand and get on the record. We'd like to open it now for comments on the report as a whole. If you have any general comments or general questions that you feel the Commission might either help you with or you'd like the Commission to hear about. Yes, sir. Would you stand up? Yeah.
I'm Pastor Neil Bowden from Texas, Louisiana Synod, and I think this would apply more to the part concerning ordination of women. I've heard many people mention a problem that they're worried about with the ecumenical movement. Dr. Jeremiah mentioned this as a concern of the committee, and I look forward to the time when all Lutherans are together and all ecumenical, or all bodies are together, but what difference does it really make what anyone else thinks if we believe something to be right? I think for too long we've worried about what other groups are going to say, and we have failed to really make a stand on anything. And I think this not only applies to ordination of women, but it applies to some other statements, that it's high time that we actually stand on our own 2 feet and say what we really think.
Thank you. Other comments, questions, suggestions? Yes, sir.
I'm Theodore Carlson, Pacific Southwest. The framers of the statement anticipate that there would be followed some redefinition, either at synods or in the congregation of the LCA, in what the composition is legally of both the synods and the church. By definition, it is ministers and congregations, or congregations and ministers. What with the redefinition, if you will, a more flexible and looser definition of the word ministry and its function, you anticipate that this may occur. Because at the time that most of the synod documents were prepared, the experience was at that time that ministry was led into parish ministry, and I anticipate something quite different from this statement.
I think we could say two things just briefly here. One is that the current Constitution does make provision also for pastors who are not serving congregations but in general work. They do make specific reference by using that phrase to the longer or to the non-parish kind of minister. The Commission realizes that in the long run there may be some rolling readjustment in terms of definition, but it would simply be a definition of ordained clergy which would continue to preserve the, shall we say, bipartite representation that we now have. It would not make the classification any looser. It would simply include perhaps more people in the group called ministers. individuals which by our present definition would not be in the subgroup ministers. But the two groupings would still be maintained because the documents define what a minister is, according to the principles laid down in the standards for acceptance and so on and continuance of the ministry. Does that speak?
The answer to my question is also the answer suggests to me that I think it's fairly clear that we may expect, if the statement is adopted, that laymen in the Synod may be asking the re-examination of who, for example, is entitled to vote at Synod convention, because we find increasingly, for example, in Pacific Southwest Synod, a great number of the persons participating in voting persons at the convention are chaplains and so forth, and aren't committed character. So I think that this should be anticipated.
Okay, that's a very, very good point. Yes, sir.
You ask first for a general reaction to the statement in its entirety, and my own personal feeling about the statement in its entirety is that I'm sorry that the Commission decided to attach the weight of its philosophical stance on the ministry and its theological posture to the formulations that are traditional and historic, namely the ministry of word and sacrament. I was hoping that there would be a redefinition or a new look at the ministry that would perhaps approach it from a different point of view, not simply for the sake of change, but because it seems to me that at this point in our history, the ministry of word and sacrament, namely the preaching and the living out of the representational ministry as is described here, and the administration of the sacraments is something that we're trying more and more to share within the Church and not keep to the exclusive domain of the ordained clergy. However, the essence of the Church, which we're really talking about here, seems to me is captured in a concept of perhaps the pastor as teacher, rabbi perhaps, and perhaps as a director of the parish life, where an educational prerequisite is necessary in order that the essence of that ministry be kept alive. And so as Richard Niebuhr several years ago defined the emerging clergy as pastoral director or teacher director, I was hoping that that kind of ingredient, rather than harking back to a 16th century formulation, might be the kind of thing that we would begin to point to. Now, specifically, I think the recommendations that are made here so far as changes in the Constitution, are all affirmative, with the exception
Well,
of,
could you hold that if we're going to get to a specific recommendation? I'll come back to you on that, but thank you. Your basic concern is that we continue to use ministry, word, and sacrament rather than breaking into a totally new concept of ministers such as the Niebuhr report provides or others.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
John Chris over in New York.
Yes, sir.
I would like to raise a question about the process by which this report was delivered to us. A number of us are very concerned about the fact that it suddenly is dropped in our laps just prior to the convention. Something that ought to be discussed within ministeriums, among the pastors, among the congregations themselves. There just was no time for this kind of thing. I wish you would speak to that.
Yes. I would say, first of all, that we share your disappointment. The Commission, this was not the way we had hoped to be able to operate. There were two reasons that limited us. One was the enormous complexity of dealing with the numbers of bylaws and so on required referral to, for example, legal counsel in the church to be sure that we covered all the points and so on. And by the time this process was completed, we were moving already toward deadline for publication. As you know, we've been working on it for 4 years, really, 3.5 years. And the second consideration was that in the view of the church, the officers of the church, it is the convention here that is to decide this question. And they did not want instructed delegations to come. They did not want the decisions to be made on local levels or in synodical meetings, so that when pastors or delegates came here, the die was already cast. They said that it was at this point where we should hammer out our definition, because you people are the elected delegates to decide this question. And therefore, the decision was to let you do it. Now, that limited us immediately in terms of how widely it could be discussed elsewhere. We would have preferred a much wider discussion. It's partly our fault and partly the polity consideration of who is the decision-making body in the church. This is the way it was. Dr. Haken.
I should like to respond.
You want to come up here?
Insofar as it was possible during this 2 years plus period to develop a corporate sense of study, we try to carry it out. It should be noted that this report actually means to initiate a process. In my judgment, the principal recommendation here is in the asking for the creation of a permanent commission on the ministry, which involves a re-evaluation of the total structure of commissions and various departments of the church. So we do not try to hide our evil deeds or misdeeds or omissions, but looking at it realistically, I think this ought to set us in motion in a common effort to create a deep and a truly realistic conception of who is the minister of the gospel.
One other point, we also tried through the Lutheran, as soon as the report was ready, to get it to you so that you could at least read it, although, and if local groups had a chance to discuss it, well, we're happy for that. We're glad you used the opportunity. We're sorry it wasn't greater. Yes, here.
Schenberger, Virginia Synod on a layman. And my concern is with the use of the term ministry. I understand through your explanation that there was a much longer statement in 1966 regarding the total ministry of the church, and that this was discarded in dealing with the two principal questions that the commission felt was its work. However, the statement does say one biblical affirmation has governed our thinking. All Christians are ministers. It says, therefore, the word ministry cannot be reserved for the work of the ordained clergy. However, there is inconsistency throughout the recommendations on the use of the word minister and ministry, not the least of which is the title of Article 7 of the Constitution itself, with which the Commission does not even deal. I think that the statement which I read about all Christians being ministers is universally considered to be valid, and I feel that in that case, the Commission might be a little more careful about how it uses the word minister and ministry. And I hear it used in these discussions right now to mean ordained clergy, when really this is not the proper use of the word. So I would like the Commission to pay some attention to how it has used this word in its recommendations. I think that there might be 8 or 10 instances in the recommendations themselves where this word is used to mean ordained clergy, and I believe that it should be differentiated. I would just like to ask this question: how is the word used in the title? Is that used in the all-inclusive sense?
The title comes from the mandate of the church, comprehensive study of the doctrine of the ministry. That was what we were told to study. However, in the content of what we were told to study, it was obvious that it related principally to the ministry of ordained clergymen. And therefore, we have tried in our report to concentrate on those questions. Who is a clergyman? And I might say, well, you continue, then I'll try to clarify why we did what we did.
Well, then
recommendation which Dr. Hickman mentioned about a permanent commission to study the ministry, I also would like to know how the term is used there.
You'll notice that in our recommendations we have reference to lay people's participation in the church, not only in terms of participation in the administration of sacraments, but also in terms of patterns of partnership for laymen and clergymen and so on. I use the word clergyman because that's the word that the Commission used through most of its deliberations, rather than minister. The word minister appears partly because it would have required a considerable recultivation of the entire constitutional field if we were going to root out every time the word minister appeared and substitute something else. So in order to make our task as focused as possible, we focused on those things which dealt with what the Constitution refers to as a minister, which is, in our parlance, a clergyman, an ordained clergyman. It would be our hope, I'm sure, all of us, that part of the work of this ongoing commission would be to explore the total ministry of the church without being under the pressure of having to come back, you see, to the church at large with specific recommendations on the particular thorny points that had to be settled quickly in order that decisions could be made about the role or the status of certain specific ordained clergymen. Your point is well taken, and I'm simply trying to explain that we weren't quite as unthinking in our use of the term as it appears here. It was partly a matter of cutting down the number of constitutional changes to be made at this time.
Laymen don't read constitutions very often, so I don't get too emotional involved.
Yeah. Yes, Lindbeck.
Raising a question, will be able to explain. I'm raising a question regarding the use of the word official, representative official, in page 264.
Does it occur in that order there, or is it official representative? Okay, thank you.
These terms, rather technical terms, appear in your recommendation. And I wonder why introduce them in just one place, where they don't see absolutely essential, because it makes your report virtually a necessary supplement or annex to the recommendation.
Yes, is that the extent of the question? Why it only...
Omit or to substitute other terms for the terms official representative in your recommendation, thereby making something quite so technical.
Right. Originally, the term did not appear there. The terms did not appear. It was suggested, however, that in order for the people who are going to have to decide these issues, that if we were placing a great deal of weight on this reinterpretation, which we've discussed, that there ought to be two things. One, a place in the official documents where the terms appeared so that they could use them as guidelines in deciding cases, and secondly, some place to which they could refer for the meaning of those terms. And your question would be either why not leave it out or have in, I suppose, also some more comprehensive statement as to the definition of the term official representative. That would be another option, wouldn't it?
Yes, and also third alternative, why not be consistent? I mean, say, sometimes you use the phrase ordained minister, and sometimes you use the phrase official representative in the recommendation.
Yes. The last is the easiest question to answer because it relates to the fact that paragraph 9 deals for who may be ordained or who may be admitted. And if it appears there, in that case, any other appearance of the word ordained clergyman would assume that he had come in through the straight and narrow gate which we have set up in paragraph 3 of Article 9. Dr. Heineken.
I'd just like to point out that this is not the first time when this phrase occurs in the recommendations. If you will look up further in this same column under 2, The phrase occurs there, and this is in connection with the recommendation which is to allow a so-called tent-making ministry. And in order to give guidance to those who have to determine whether or not such a ministry would be acceptable, the phrase official representative ministry is used, but it is nowhere defined in the recommendations. And that is the reason why under 6, which is part of this whole series of recommendations dealing with the tent-making ministry, the term is defined so that those who have to make a decision with respect to giving a call to a tent-making ministry will have some guidance as to what is meant by an official representative ministry. This is the reason why this was specifically added, if I'm not entirely mistaken.
The time is getting to the point where if it's suitable with you, we could move to specific recommendations, but you had already asked the floor before.
Elton George, Pacific Northwest Synod.
Yes, sir.
I'm disappointed that more reference was not made to the word itself in this, laying this foundation for its understanding of the ministry of the word. And you briefly said something about that, but would you explain why more scriptural reference wasn't made in this study?
Do you mean why there were not more biblical citations to bolster our opinions? Suppose we ask one of our... Jake, do you want to deal with this?
It's very difficult to quote the Bible, that is, with relevance. As one who is responsible for biblical teaching, I feel this lack very seriously, and I cringe inside each time I read a sentence which seems to lack the full power of biblical revelation. However, this is a legislative report, and I'm sure that something of the biblical message rings through. Yet I share your feeling, but in a meeting of this kind, I think we can only hope that we can convene a seminar and investigate the biblical passages in question. I do not mean to underestimate the decisive importance of being faithful to the biblical message, but it is a problem that involves many, many other problems. I hope this gives some kind of an explanation why there are so few biblical references here. What I did inside the committee is a deep secret, and I will not bring this out in the public wash line.
Pastor Peterson.
How soon after this pastor's recommendation references the ordination of women, how soon can a woman be ordained?
It's my understanding that as soon as she would receive a proper call and a synod would consent to see this call as a valid call, if the rest of the recommendations were passed, she would be eligible for ordination.
The reason I ask is because one person in the commission gives me practice, but the purpose of the commission is to constantly evaluate what happens because of our action here. Is that right?
No, the Commission hopes for the setting up of an ongoing group which will continue to study this question of ministry. That commission or that group is separate from the work of this commission, which ends with its report at this meeting.
The reason I ask is because what happens 2 years from now if it's not working out for the ordination of women? What do you then do as a church?
What do you do with the women is the question. If it's all right, in terms of time, we could perhaps pass to allow now specific questions as well, and if some of you still have general comments to make, that's all right. But let's...
I appreciate Dr. Hakenen's observation. It does not answer my discomfort with a hermeneutic problem upon which I must vote tomorrow, and which the pastor raises here. Secondly, I don't clearly understand why the officers of the church feel that this report is different from confirmation and First Communion, in which the congregations of our three churches were asked to study and give their opinions to this convention and to the conventions of the other two church bodies. I think this is a major concern for the future of the church. I'm not pleased that the questions I have hermeneutically have been answered sufficiently so that I can vote one way or another tomorrow, and certainly not with the power of the Spirit. I'm very unhappy at this stage of the discussion.
Okay. Yes.
Petticoat from Ohio. I wonder why in the lifting up of the name of the Synod President to Bishop, you raise him because you feel that he needs more pastoral care. Then in several instances where he must really give pastoral care, you bypass him. In the instance where a minister demits, or let me read it, where a minister voluntarily resigns.
Can you cite the passage there?
Yes, this is on page 259, the amendment to number 3 on 259. When a minister voluntarily resigns from the ministry, I'm reading item 10, he must request reinstatement to the examining committee. And the examining committee then makes the favorable action, not the president of the synod, who is now called bishop, to whom this care of ministers. On the next page, a minister serving under a call, item 11, who leaves the work of the ministry, again asks for reinstatement from the examining committee. And in neither instance does there seem to be any of the so-called episcopal pastoral care that you did in raising the name president to bishop. It seems to me this is a contradiction.
Are you more worried about the pastoral care side or the bishop side?
I'm worried about the pastoral care side. I don't see the examining committee as being that which can give the pastoral care.
In the first place, the procedure is not really that much different if you will compare with the original situation in item 10. Now, it may be that you didn't like the old system either. In each case, I'm talking about item 3 on page 259. The demission voluntarily is done by giving written notice of the fact to the president. That was the old way. The president then did not consult with the pastor, but with the examining committee. Our new procedure is simply a restatement of that using the word resign, and the standards for bringing the pastor back into active service is an attempt to make it regular so that he's not singled out as some kind of psychotic, but that his procedure of being reinstated in the ministry is about the same as that of a man who would otherwise go before the examining committee and be certified for readmission into the church. This may not satisfy your concern at the point. We did not want to make the process of demission into a greater psychological crisis than it already is.
I think you're missing totally the point he's talking about, Dr.
I hope then if you could clarify that.
Well, the point that he's making is that by the use of the term bishop, the emphasis hopefully is to change from a gavel to the crux, this business.
Yes.
And that, but by making the changes with reference to restoration after demittal or any of those areas, the shift is away from the very bishop, the very pastor of pastors who was described in the earlier doctrine. I think this is the point you're trying to make. And the cast is different. It makes no difference to me as a synod president which route we go, but I think the truth would be served better if we'd acknowledge there is a difference. The emphasis is on the examining committee in your report, not upon the president of synod or the bishop as the case would be. That was the point he was making.
Okay. The cast, I think, is about the same. It may be the roles are slightly different. Yes, sir.
I would like to talk to this matter of the change in title and function. I think it's a most desirable thing to have a pastor of pastors.
George, why don't you use the mic?
But this is not George Farrell, Iowa Synod. But this is not going to be done by the device that we have here suggested. I'm sorry. The real problem is a role problem. And I think this title business has nothing to do with it. Anybody who has power over people, my Roman Catholic friends say, the moment somebody becomes a bishop, he never again has a bad meal or hears an honest word. And now this illustrates, here you have a situation of tremendous power, almost dictatorial power. And if you give people that kind of power, then of course you really eliminate them from this pastoral role. In other words, let me say I have a terrible moral problem. Now, if I go to my synod president with this terrible moral problem, he has a double responsibility. He's immediately a double bind, because he has a responsibility to all these people and there's a responsibility to me. And if he is any kind of a truly moral person, he will take into account all these other people and get rid of me. And because of the position in which he is, he has to act like this. Now, in other words, if you want a pastor, you have to take his power away from him. That means I don't want to get involved in the whole document. There are many good things in the document. I'm basically for the document. But at this point, we are playing with words, and we don't get at the issue. Whether you can call him anything you want to. And personally, I have no great hang-up on any of this. But by playing around with words, you don't get at a very real problem. And the very real problem is that a president of synod has power, should have power. I'm not saying he shouldn't. But in the moment he has power, then he cannot function as a pastor. Part of the reasons that you can function as a pastor, I talk to the pastors now, is that you have so little power. That means in the moment I got into a position in the university where I had power, I couldn't function as a pastor. In that moment, I had to make decisions a different way. So please don't think you have solved anything by this verbal business here. There is a real issue you are dealing with, but you're not getting at it by changing title, and you're not getting and by changing his administrative functions. If you want a pastor to pastors, you have to get somebody who doesn't have any power over the pastors, and then you would have that. Thank you.
I would like the delegates here to consider whether or not that statement is really correct. The Commission studied considerably on this question, and it's very attractive, very romantic to say that because a man has power over you, he cannot act as your pastor. Our feeling is that the problems that pastors face are not necessarily great moral issues, but what they need is someone to say, I know what you're doing a good job, I can help you. And that only a man with power can tell a pastor who needs to know that he's doing the kind of job that he ought to be doing. And that if a man does not have the power, it's very easy to say, you're doing fine, or if I were in your place, I'd certainly try to do the same thing. I think you ought to consider very seriously from whom the word of approval, the word of real concern means the most. From a man who has power over you, or whether it's a person who is simply a friend or someone who can come in from the outside and listen to your difficulties with the parish. I think it's on that basis. Now, that's the consideration I'd like to have you think about. The question of changing the title, admittedly, is only a symbol of something which we hope will be deeper. We certainly don't think that the title would do it. We hope, however, that the moving away from an administrative title might at least assist both synods and church officials to realize the pastoral relationship which is already in the Constitution of synod presidents to their pastors. Yes, sir.
Louder.
I would like to first, I won't speak on this matter of bishops,
but I would like to tie it to just what you, Mr. Chairman, said, and also what Dr. Farrell. I'm not sure what kind of power
Can you?
Dr. Farrell.
It's difficult to hear you, I think.
Come up here, Toivo.
All right. Go ahead and spread your hand.
I'm not sure what kind of power he had in mind when he spoke of the power as a reason why you cannot function as a pastor. Pastor's pastor or a parish pastor. I have been parish pastor quite a long time, though not at the present time. And my feeling is this, that I have been able to be only parish pastor thanks to the authority which I have received in the holy ordination. The authority coming from the Lord himself through his apostolate, which he perpetuated by laying on his hands to his apostles. And it is my concept of the church and of the ministry. I know there are different theories among us, that the 12 apostles are not the prototype of the church, but they are the prototype of the ministry. And for this reason, ladies and gentlemen, I am a little bit uneasy about this matter of ordaining the women. It was said very nicely by Professor Irma, and I agree very much what she said about our Lord's attitude to the women. It certainly was above the ordinary level of the society in those days, and his attitude to the children. And therefore I cannot help asking in my mind, was there some reason, some deeper reason, which is not a sociological, why he did not ordain any of these wonderful, devoted, and rather brave women? Shame on the apostles at the time of our Lord's crucifixion. Who are at the cross? The women and John. Yet he does not ordain any of them, but only the men. This is the question that concerns me. And therefore I do feel that we desperately need in this age, in this country, a pastor for the pastors. And of course I am delighted that the Commission comes with the suggestion that we would have an episcopate, at least in some sense, that they would be called pastors, and that their duties would be primarily those of pastoral nature. But what I would like to do, and I'll come to the close, is that all major decisions, such as ordaining of the women, such as establishing episcopate or bishops in our church, because they are major decisions to be done in consultation with the other Christian churches in the World Council, and now Rome being part of the faith and order movement. I am deeply committed in my own conscience not to do anything that would create roadblocks to Christian unity. And I fear I'm not as optimistic as Professor Irma was about these ecumenical ramifications. But as for bishops, this is what we need. But I think also that we do not need the kind of bishops that has to be voted every 4th year. If a bishop is to be a pastor's pastor, not only to the clergy but also to the laity, he is a sort of house father of the large family. And I simply ask a simple question. Something is basically wrong with the family if it would have to meet every 4th year to raise the question, shall we keep our father or not?
Yes. We have your attention, please.
I'm Colleen Griffin, the delegate from Convo 70, and I would like to talk about, well, 2 main things I've come here to say tonight as a message to you from Convo 70. We played a game.
Can you come up here? I think we'd welcome you to the podium.
Our first day at Convo 70, we played a game called Loophole. It was a situation game in which we held what was more or less what is going on here. We tried to put ourselves in your position right now. We played a little game of negotiations, and when we were through, we played this game for 2.5 hours, and we spent another 2.5 hours afterwards evaluating it. And to put it mildly, most of us were pretty well horrified, because as we sat there, we'd argue over the terms, as I'm sorry to say you're doing now, and we'd argue over how much we didn't like this word, or we'd like it rephrased that way. And we completely forgot that we were there to do God's work. When the youth delegates lost their power, we just completely forgot even consulting them. And I'm not putting in a plug for the youth. It's just a fact. We made the mistake too. When the minority groups lost their power in the game, nobody bothered to consult them, to ask them what they thought, to get their opinions. What Convo would like to say to you tonight is, whatever decisions you make, please not put the most effort on the terms that are used, but the thought behind it. Convo is asking you this week to put God back into this convention. Not that he's gone completely, but that maybe he's just having to take second place a little bit. Please put Christ first in your mind as you approach these issues. Secondly, I've been asked to speak on the ordination of women. Convo 70 has asked me to tell you that we favor the ordination of women. As my group in Convo 70 discussed this through the week, we brought up many different issues as to why we feel this way. Going to the point of biblical reference, as we look at the situation of Paul, as we look at the situation of women at the time of the writings of the Bible, at the time of Paul, we find that the position Paul took in his relationships with women was extremely, more or less, radical. Women of that time had very little value at all to society except to walk behind the men in the society. Paul's church at Philippi, he founded on the women, I believe you will find if you check it out. It was started by women. When he went to Philippi to visit Philippi, he found protection by the women. He was kicked out of Philippi, and it was the women who supported him there and who hid him and helped him develop the church. And it was on those women that he developed that church at Philippi. He also approached the women in a different way. Any woman at that time who wore long hair was considered a prostitute. He encouraged women, therefore, to grow long hair and be proud of it. Also, women at that time could only wear scarves over their hair if they were women of nobility. Paul also encouraged them to wear scarves over their hair and be proud of it, as if they were as good as any other woman. He therefore was, for his time, taking radical steps towards bringing forth women. That's why I feel that the church, our church today, should have no qualms about bringing women to their rightful place. I don't think it should be a matter of whether or not people will accept this woman, or whether or not she's going to have any great hang-ups, but whether or not this woman, any woman, has the right to preach the gospel of God in the position of an ordained minister. And it is the decision of Convo 70, the majority of we youth at Convo 70, that every woman, if she decides she wants to be an ordained minister, has this right. Thank you. That is the message from Convo 70.
As you may know, the youth were asked to provide one speaker. So our speaker has spoken not, as she said, for herself alone, but for the youth who are here to try to help the church in making its decisions. Now, other comments here. Yes?
I'd like to comment on Section A, the substitute word here on A.
Could you give the page reference too, please?
Sorry, 261.
261.
The candidate for ordination, with the exceptions indicated, he should be a graduate of an accredited college, university, normally theological seminary of his church. If he has pursued his theological education somewhere else, and it goes on to talk about all these other things. But the thing that disturbs me is the last paragraph. Any variance from the procedure, any variance from the procedure, above procedure, shall require the approval of a panel consisting of the president of the church, or his appointee, or the president of the synod, the president of the synod, and
and the executive secretary of the Board of Theological Education. Now, does this mean then that this particular panel can lessen the requirements for entering the ministry?
Let me consult. Does one of our members here have the responsibility of that particular item? Dr. Heineken, did you understand the question? Whether the exception provided on page 262 at the top would lessen the requirements. Is that correct? Lessen the requirements?
I don't think that this would result at all if the convention accepts these requirements. Then they would stand, I would think, as the minimum. But there are always alternatives. There are different ways of meeting the same basic requirements. And it is in order not to hamstring these possibilities that this final appeal is allowed. If there were no appeal from a stated procedure of any kind, then I think in exceptional cases an injustice could be done. But I would think that those who are stated as those to whom the appeal is made would see that the substance of those requirements of the church are met. So it would not mean a lessening of the requirements, but a provision of a satisfactory alternative.
Would you like a little more on that? You look a little worried still.
The way that I read this is I see that it can do this. You have opened up the loophole, as you say here, so that an individual could come into the ministry without the necessary qualifications. And I'm concerned about this because that we in the black clergy are being faced with this possibility. And I'm sure that this is the thinking of the members of the black clergy, that they don't want this particular provision.
I can say historically, and there's very little difference between this statement and the preceding one, which also allowed for exception to the rule. Historically, the rule has been interpreted very strictly, and it has been basically a question of equivalence rather than of dispensation from. Now, questions over here? Yes, sir.
Very briefly, sir, I think you invited a little bit earlier in response to Dr. Farrell's comment as to...
Yes, you're going to have to turn sideways, I think.
Very briefly, in response to Dr. Farrell's comment, which I suspect he said that the office of authority and the office of shepherding in the term of bishop seem to be mutually incompatible. I'm a great admirer of George Farrell, but I must confess that at this point I'm surprised at this rather simplistic approach. It does seem to me that to be rather romanticist about the whole matter, the role of a parent combines these identical two. The parent has the office of love to be exercised toward the child. He certainly has the office of discipline to be exercised with the child. He's not a split personality. He's one person with a dual role. It seems to be fully compatible that a bishop is serving both offices, that both the gospel and the law could be applicable in the one bishop shepherd of the pastor.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, I would like to speak as a layman. I think Dr. Farrell has put his finger on a very sensitive nerve regarding the matter of power. We as laymen have been hearing that we should be ministers as laymen. And I think one of the things that has to do with power is the sensitivity of the layman, not only those who are still in the church, but some who have seen fit to leave, But one of their sensitive points is that when it comes to the matter at the congregational level, by most constitutions, laymen, the congregation, have the power to call a pastor. But when they run into a situation where that pastor has become very unsuitable and unpastoral, they feel very powerless as to how to rescind a call, and there seems to be very little constitutional provision. So speaking as a layman, I think this powerlessness in this area is an area in which the nerves are very sensitive, and I think that Dr. Farrell has a very valid point.
Thank you. Yes. You may have to come up here.
Oh, I think you can hear.
Okay, I can, yes.
Yes, I'm going to speak to Dr. Perry on this point and also related to this young lady. This young lady. It seems to me that on the whole question of why none of the apostles were women, I think we have a little exegetical homework to do. In the first place, women in Judaism of the pre-Christian time were not all, did not have such bad status. And I think we do a great disservice to this issue if we say, look how bad it was in Judaism, look how good it was in Christianity. I think it's not only wrong exegetically, but it promotes a kind of uncritical anti-Semitism. The Jewish woman in the early pre-Christian time had a very definite status, which was that she was the woman partner in the household. Her job was the mother and the raising of the children. Her job was within the private realm of the home. There were very definite regulations on what she could do and what she could not do. You know, she couldn't read the Torah, she couldn't read the and her role was definitely a sex role. And the rabbinic literature is full of references to don't let women speak out because their hair is alluring and beguiling. They have a sex role, strictly. But they did have a very important status because the role of the family and the childbearing role was a very important role. So, the thing that's different in the early Christian period, in the primitive church at the time of the apostles, the choosing of the apostles has to do with a vocational role. At that time of Jesus, there was no possibility for women to have a vocational role in the public sphere. What's extremely interesting is that in the primitive church, in the post-Jesus period, in the apostolic times, which is where this young girl was writing, that a new role emerged for women, that she actually became a free person on her own. In other words, the beginning of the celibate orders, which allowed women a freedom and a status within the Christian community, which did not tie her to the family and childbearing role. This is so revolutionary that it's, it was just unbelievable. It didn't exist in Greek or Roman or it didn't exist in the history of the world before. The beginning of the celibate orders in the early Christian community were very profound. They had to be enormously profound, meaning because it really had to do with the new status of human freedom. It was an extremely important issue. I just wanted to bring some clarity.
Yes, thank you. Rather than rebuttal, I'd like to get as many people who wish to make comments to the Commission about specific recommendations or questions to be cared for first, and then we'll go around again. Yes, sir?
A specific item on page 264, we've been there before, item 2, where in this tent-making ministry, it is to have a functional relationship to the purpose of the official representative ministry, either providing a secure basis for support or enabling you to enter strategic areas and so forth. Do we really mean that the only kind of tent-making ministry that we would justify under this would be one which serves the official representative ministry? Do we not mean the purpose of the church rather than the purpose of the ministry? I can see a number of items referred to here as qualifying, which I would not see relating specifically to the function of the purpose of the ministry, but relating to the purpose of the church.
I followed you up to your last few clauses where you said you could see instances or you could see concrete cases or something like that.
For instance, teachers of religion in universities, who have a body of knowledge which they are certified to proclaim or to teach, but who are specifically restricted from being proponents of the Christian faith, as teachers. How would that be related to the purpose of the ministry? I can see that it would have a relationship to the purpose of the church in acquainting people about the faith and about the teaching, but how would it be related specifically to the purpose of the ministry in its representative part?
The problem here is that we're dealing in these articles specifically with the question of who may be and who may continue to be a clergyman, an ordained clergyman. Therefore, we have to say, since we have traditionally defined this role in a functional way, that is, you are a minister as long as, or a clergyman, as long as you function as a clergyman. You do what the church has said is an ordained ministry, qualifies you as an ordained ministry.
The function is defined in relation to the purpose of the church. Now you are defining another ministry in relation to the function of the ministry, not the function of the church.
Let me clarify, are you concerned about the wording or the whole concept that this seems to restrict this occupation to a relationship to the official representative ministry?
That's right. It seems to me that the concept of the ministry in this area, which is derived from the other ministry, simply puts them in a subsidiary role. That is, the real ministry is being performed by others. And this is a ministry because it supports that ministry. Now that would be, I think, a secondary kind of definition of the ministry. The ministry of that group ought to be defined in relation to the purpose of the church, just as the ministry, the representative ministry, is defined in relation to the purpose of the church.
If I follow you, I think we're dealing with two circles. The function of the ministry of the church would be the larger, and then the function of its ordained clergy would be a smaller circle, or a circle within or related to the other. To define it simply in terms of the larger circle would mean that we're saying that anyone would be entitled to do any kind of work because this is the ministry of all Christians, the function of the church, the ministry of the church.
I don't believe that's the case.
Well, this is the way we've tried to deal with how a man may support himself in an ordained ministry without saying that it has to be full-time church work all the time that he's doing. Yes. Excuse me. Yeah, all right, both of you, but
I am Mr. Willets, Earl Willets, lay delegate and treasurer of the Nebraska Synod. Not to rehash it and to bury it, Dr. Farrell's comments on the bishop, I think I could not agree. Certainly, as I look at it, the Synod President, the bishop, is the pastor of pastors and should be just that. I think something of the mistake that we make within synods is that we have loaded down the Synod presidents with so much work and so many things that he does not have the opportunity to act as such a pastor of pastors. I am very concerned that we do not make more use of lay people within synod offices, synod presidencies as assistants. Some have, I realize. I think there would be much more chance of a bishop, a synod president, to be a pastor of pastors if that were the case. I draw the parallel to myself. I'm a CPA. I have a firm of my own. Together with two partners, we have a number of accountants with us. I guess they have referred to me as the senior partner. At many times I have to intercede between the accountant and the client. The bishop does the same thing with his pastor and congregation, and certainly I think we ought to look to him for this.
I'm Louis Bell from New Jersey, and I have a very practical question to the Commission on this matter of tent-making ministry. I'm trying to remember also the context in which the apostle himself referred to earning his livelihood by the work of his hand. What if such a situation arose as did after the war in Germany, where all of a sudden dozens of ex-enemy DPs were thrown into a strange economy where there was no church organization to recognize them or not to recognize them as ministers, and yet these people went and got a job, any kind of a job they could, worked as KPs for the American Army, or anything they could lay hold of, and in the meantime went on and carried on the proclamation of the gospel and the administering of the sacraments. How would the Commission look at this kind of situation?
It was a great task those people did, and we hope we don't have to face it. We can't write a constitution for emergency situations. There is in the Constitution some provision for local activities where organization breaks down, where the local congregation names its members, names members to perform certain specific acts. That record is a fine one, and our Commission hopes that it won't have to be repeated here, but we hope our people are willing to do it if necessary. The time is of such a point now where I would suggest this. First, Dr. Heikkinen has a comment he wishes to make on this ongoing study, which has been touched on a couple of times. And there are a couple of other people who want to make presentations or comments. And then there are at least two people, I think, who would like to make statements in rebuttal. I might also say this. Obviously, some of the questions which have been raised here will be further discussed on the floor. And if you don't have the opportunity to say all you want here tonight, that is obviously understandable. We do expect that these issues will be thoroughly discussed later. This is an attempt to try to sort out the main issues for you. If I may ask, call now on Dr. Heikkinen.
I should like to make a couple of comments on recommendation E, point 2, the ongoing study. It was Lester Pearson who said that the way to nowhere is paved with good reports. We're very grateful for the questions have punctured holes in this report. The question was raised about the meeting of ministry in point A under 2. The total ministry, that is, the servant body of Jesus Christ, is referred to. But there is implied the leadership of the community, which falls upon what we call the ordained ministry. Ministry is such a great, awesome, profound problem. In fact, it's a mystery which we can never fully fathom. In the modern revolutionary situation, it requires continuous study. Now the fundamental points. This study is to be a corporate study. If committees do the study alone and then give a report, package it out, not much good can come out of it. I hope that a committee of this kind has now come to its ultimate eschatological dissolution, that no more committees in the ministry be named, because the matter is too serious, too many-sided, to be dealt with in this way. So this study is to be a continuous corporate study, the study of all, of the entire church. And there are some very important practical issues. We need to have a research apparatus which informs the leadership of the church what is really going on in the world, in the minds of young men and young women serving the church. You're all acquainted with so-called sensitivity programs. Some of them turn out to be insensitivity programs, depending upon the measure of maturity. This is an extremely delicate problem. We need guidance. We have books that appear on pastoral ministry. What kind of a psychological presupposition do they project? I think the church needs guidance. Just a final word for the thought that we mean business to move forward, all of us together, performing a common ministry in the study of ministry.
Now, comments, Pastor Hargenpfell.
I would like only one clarification from you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
In the light of the remarks that were made concerning the ministry of the women in the early church, with which I'm very familiar because my specialty is early churches, is it the intention of the commission that these women who might be ordained, like our deaconesses, are unmarried, or will they also be married women? And if the latter is the case, that certainly would create some serious practical problems. As you can well imagine, it's also a mother, and there's certainly a tension and a problem. If you have 2, 3, 4 young children and you are a pastor of a modern kind of parish, which is a very exacting duty. But if it's a kind of parallel to our deaconesses, well, that's a different story. But you
Okay.
don't say.
Margaret, would you like to?
Well, just briefly, we don't mean it either. I feel that whether a woman is married or not, I happen to be a mother of 2 boys, and I raised myself from 1 to 4, and I taught and worked, and I think they're doing all right. I simply feel that what is private to a person is really private, and if a woman is qualified as a physician, or as a psychologist, or as a teacher, or as a proclaimer of the gospel, she should be hired on her qualifications. I realize the practical difficulties, but if she doesn't have that much sense to arrange these practical matters to the benefit of the church and to the use of her creative abilities, then she would not be ordained, I hope. I think a lot of men are ordained who don't solve practical problems. So I really think this is not irrelevant. I'm not trying to, we know what the problems are, but the whole business of marriage and the family is changing under pressure of society. It is said that the Mother's Day of tomorrow will be dedicated to the woman who adopts 2 children and has none of her own because of the ecological and, the whole problem. There are vast ramifications of this, and we cannot build them all into this document. It is self-fulfillment of meeting the needs of the church. The church should not be deprived of services that are valuable, whether she's a mother or not.
Thank you very much for your time and attention, and we hope that these issues will help you deal with the question when it comes to the floor tomorrow, convention tomorrow.